Welcome to the second live session of online course on sustainable development provisions in free trade agreements. Today we will follow the order that we did yesterday. Firstly, I will go through the selected difficult questions from the quiz. Please kindly note that I will only talk about selected ones, and if you do have questions about other questions, please email me and I will always reply. So let me share my screen with you and let's get started on the quiz part. Okay, the quiz part. First question is regarding SMEs related provisions in FTAs. Which of the following statements is correct? So the correct answer is number A. SMEs related provisions are defined as any provisions mentioning explicitly small and medium enterprises, including micro firms and startups. This is a well-established and broadly accepted definition and also used in our course materials. I see that most of you actually choose the answer D, which means all the above options are correct. In fact, they are not true because number B, the vast majority of FTAs in force and notified to the WTO incorporate at least one provision explicitly mentioning SMEs. This is not true because only 49% of FTAs are with SME provisions. And option C, all other FTA provisions have the potential to help SMEs even without explicit reference to SMEs. Not all other FTA provisions have the potential, but that's true that there are some provisions, for example, the provisions reducing tariffs, ensure market access, and trade facilitation provisions may have the potential to help MSMEs to engage in international trade, but not all provisions are beneficial for MSMEs. That's why the correct answer of this question is option A. Turning to the second question, mapping the coverage of SME provisions in FTAs. Which of the following statements is true? The correct answer is option B. Among FTAs that incorporate SME-related provisions, North-South FTAs have a greater share than South-South FTAs. This is true, and this is covered in your self-studying videos. Number A is not true because the number of FTAs with SME-related provisions has accelerated. This was not driven by the surge in the number of SMEs, but was driven by the surge of number of agreements involving developing countries. And option C is also not true because not most FTAs containing SME-related provisions were negotiated between developed countries. The most of FTAs with SME provisions were actually negotiated between developed and developing countries. And option D is also not true, because not in average, RTAs involve the USA provide the greatest number of SME provisions. This is not true, because if we look at the number of RTAs with SME provisions, we can see that RTAs involving the USA are most likely to incorporate SME provisions, but they do not provide the greatest number of SME provisions. Question number 3.
Can you move the slides, because we can't see right now? We only see I think number 1, right?
Okay, sorry for this. I think they are moving now, right?
Now they are moving, yes.
Okay, sorry for that. So question number 3. Which type of SME provisions is most likely to be considered as deep provisions? So the correct answer is specific commitments or obligations related to SMEs. I see that many of you choose the option C, sorry, which is institutional arrangement. It is true that institutional support is indeed very important for SME cooperation, for example, but however, they don't provide as deep or as substantive obligations as specific commitment provisions do. So that's why the most likely type of provisions which would be considered as deep provision is those provisions lay down specific commitments or obligations. They're more likely to be binding than institutional arrangements. Question number 4. Regarding the enforceability of SME provisions, which statement is correct? The correct number is option C. When SME reservations are made in services schedules of an RTA, any dispute related to such reservation can be subject to dispute settlement mechanisms applicable to the service chapter. This is true because it's a common practice to list commitments in service schedules, and such schedules are attachments to service trade chapter together as a part of an FTA. Therefore, if there is no special note, there's no special note saying, well, commitments in schedules are not subject to dispute settlement mechanisms. They are all subject to dispute settlement mechanisms, regardless of whether they are reservations specially made to certain group of companies. That's why correct answer is option C. And I briefly explain why the option B is not correct, because many of you choose this one. The CPTPP has a dedicated SMEs chapter and provides resource to dispute settlement for issues arising under SME chapter. It's true that the CPTPP has a dedicated SME chapter, which is chapter 24, but there is a provision specifically saying no application of dispute settlement to any issues arising under this chapter. So that's why this option is also not true. Question number 5, which of the following health-related provisions is binding? And we've talking about binding languages yesterday as well. So for this question, the correct answer is number A. Each party shall maintain laws and regulations to secure public health of the region. The language shall maintain here creates an binding obligation for parties, and you can see in option B, the language is shall strive to. Shall strive to is not a binding language in RTAs, and option C contains the language to the extent possible, and it also used the word should, so they are not as binding as shall in legal text. Option D is an aspirational provision which uses affirm their commitment, so it's not a binding provision either. Question number 6. Which of the following health-related provisions has the strongest enforceability? We've also talking about enforceability yesterday. The enforceability actually always related to how binding the provision is. The binding provisions always have stronger enforceability, but in this question, both option B and option D has the language shall maintain or shall refrain. They are both binding actually, but why the correct answer is option D? That is because option D provides more specific explanation on how to interpret this provision. So in these provision text, usually less specificity means more discretion in implementation. That's why for option D, it is easier to judge whether there is a violation, which means it is more likely to successfully challenge a violation through dispute settlement mechanisms. That's why option D has stronger enforceability than option B, even they are both binding. Last question. A health-related measure that is trade restrictive can be justified by Article 20B of the GATT 1994 if it is necessary to protect human, animal, and plant life for health. It is not applied in a manner constitutes a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail. It does not constitute a disguised restriction on international trade. The correct answer is a measure must meet all the above conditions that I just read to be justified by Article 20B of the GATT. This question is to give you some flavor on how to apply provisions in practice, especially in dispute settlement. These conditions are set out by Article 20 of the GATT, and many RTAs also use this language in their general exception provisions. So to justify a measure that the objective is to protect health, but it is trade restrictive, it must be necessary. This is to ensure its proportionality, and it must be applied in a non-discriminatory manner. This is to ensure that the measure is to ensure the compliance of the measure with the MFN principle. This question is just to let you know how the exception would work in practice. I stop here and wrap up the quiz part, and now to save time, I will hand over to Mr. Jan Duva, and he will be the moderator for the panel discussion. And if you have any other questions about the quiz, please just email me. Thank you. It's over to you, Jan, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. I hope everyone heard what you said. It was very clear on my end. If any other questions to Rachel on the quiz, please contact her directly and separately, and she'll be very happy to answer. So I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the second live sessions of the online course on sustainable development provision in free trade agreements. This is the second live session, but it's also the last live session, right? So the course is coming to an end, essentially. You'll have a few more days for those who haven't completed the quizzes to finish up the quizzes before we close down the course. We're very lucky to have with us today 3 experts, one from Asian Trade Center, one from the WHO, World Health Organization, another one from the World Trade Organization. So what they will do is share their insights on sustainable development provision in RTAs, but with a focus on MSMEs for the Asian Trade Center, on health for, as you can guess, our WHO expert, and on trade and gender, on gender-related provision for WTO. So we have an additional recorded presentation that was done by Catherine Kuhlman, who's been working closely with us on all the trade negotiation related courses. But we'll see whether we have time to play it. I mean, the priority will be to give time for the experts and to answer live some of the questions. The way we do this, the same thing as yesterday. So each experts will have 12 to 15 minutes for our presentation. And then as they speak, please, you can feel free to type your question in the chat, and they will review them. And then by the time we finish with a series of presentation, we'll give them back the floor, and they can pick some of the questions that they would like to answer to make this as interactive as possible. So let me start right away by inviting Mrs. Deborah Elms. She's the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center, also president of the Asia Business Trade Association. Among other things, she's also an advisory consultant of our core expert group under the Initiative on Model Provisions for Trade in Times of Crisis. So thank you very much, Deborah, for your contribution over the months and years to our work at ESCAP and in the UN. And then she's, as you can see, right, from everything I said, she works closely with MSMEs in Asia and the Pacific. So the request is really for her to share insights on MSME-related provisions in FTAs. What do you think is particularly useful for MSMEs in terms of provision, and that type of insight, if you can share with us. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here. I'm happy to have so many people who are interested in trade and able to answer such challenging quizzes and quiz questions. I don't know how many practitioners in the business could do well on these quizzes, because many of those questions I think are quite difficult. So anyway, congratulations to all of you who are online for completing these quizzes and getting the answers correct. So I want to talk today briefly about how do we support micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, or MSMEs. This is a critical question for governments, especially because MSMEs are the backbone of economies all across the ESCAP region. Even in a place like Singapore that you might imagine is dominated by large firms, actually 97% of the companies are considered MSMEs. And as with the rest of the region, almost all of the jobs, or at least the majority of jobs, are held by MSMEs. Now, it is true, because I get this question a lot, Singapore's definition of a micro and medium enterprise is different from, let's say, Cambodia or Laos' definition of a medium-sized enterprise, especially. But the point is that the smallest firms in an economy are the generators of an awful lot of employment and an awful lot of activity. What they tend not to do, and this is true again across most of the region, they tend not to be very well engaged in trade. And they don't engage in trade for a variety of reasons. Part of it is that they could be too small. They may be focused on their local community. They may be a very small shop, for example, a corner shop that sells provisions to a neighborhood or to a block. And they're not interested in engaging really in trade, or at least they don't see themselves as engaging in trade, even if many of the contents in their corner shop are actually imported from abroad. But they themselves would say they are not part of the trade, cross-border trade community. So if you're a government, then a key deliverable for you is to provide new opportunities for your MSME sector to engage in trade and to do so and be competitive with MSMEs from other markets and to be competitive with larger companies. So how do we do that? Well, governments increasingly have multiple ways to get MSMEs involved in trade. And in a trade agreement, I would say there are at least 4 different ways, broadly speaking, to get MSME issues onto the negotiating agenda and included in trade agreements of various kinds. The first and the most obvious is you open up a chapter called SMEs or MSMEs. And in that chapter, you have a number of explicit provisions that are related to fostering the competition and the growth and development of the MSME sector. That is the most obvious way to get MSME engagement and involvement in a trade agreement. And I understand why governments think that this is a very useful thing to do. You can get, if you have a department or an agency or a ministry responsible for MSME activities, you can have them be the lead negotiators on this chapter. And at the end of the day, when the agreement is signed, it's very easy for a leader to say, this agreement that we've just signed is comprehensive and includes special provisions or special benefits for our smallest companies to help them compete in the economy that we've just developed in this trade agreement. The challenge, I would say, for a small business, though, is making use of the MSME chapter provisions. And the main problem is that it has been very difficult for governments to come up with MSME specific provisions that are of utility for small businesses. So you can make a chapter on MSMEs, but in reality, what often happens with these chapters is that the implementation is extremely limited. The commitments in the chapter may default to having an inquiry point for MSME outreach and engagement around the FTA itself. Or, and this is increasingly the case, the parties involved in the FTA agree to set up a website that is relevant for MSMEs. And that is ultimately the key deliverable for an MSME chapter in an FTA or RTA. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that requires a certain amount of resources to develop a website that is appropriate for MSMEs. And even if you found a website that was appropriate, had the right language, could explain an RTA in a way that makes sense to a small business, and had a small business who could find that website, the challenge is that it often goes out of date very quickly. And so even if I created a brilliant website to accompany my RTA chapter on SMEs or MSMEs, I would probably find that much of the information in that website would be quickly outdated. It would not be updated domestically because I typically don't have a budget beyond the very early implementation stage to develop that website, and certainly nothing to maintain that website. And so what happens is many governments who sign these MSME chapters tend to neglect the implementation of the chapter, especially if there is a website and it gets set up, it quickly goes out of date, and then that's sort of the end of the MSME elements of an FTA. Now that's unfortunate, but the good news for smaller businesses is that's not the only way that we can support MSME development in an RTA or FTA. A second way that matters much more for small businesses is to include some sort of cooperation or capacity building chapter in the RTA or FTA, and to make sure that some of that capacity building that takes place around the implementation of the broader agreement is aimed at MSMEs, so that you have more MSME engagement. That's where you start to channel resources to develop materials, content, websites, written materials, answer help desk questions, etc., where you might be delivering on the ground results for small businesses trying to find out about the RTA or FTA. So in addition to the chapter itself, if the cooperation chapter, the capacity building, or the development chapter of a comprehensive agreement includes capacity building aimed explicitly at MSMEs, or has a commitment to do so as part of the implementation of the activities, then that's perhaps a more realistic way to help small businesses take advantage of trade in general and trade in the RTA or FTA. So the first obvious answer for how do we help small businesses, we make a chapter for them. The second way to do so is to ensure that any capacity building commitments that are made around the RTA or FTA includes MSME capacity building and development projects. But the more meaningful way actually to help small businesses is the third option, which is to ensure that the FTA or RTA is as comprehensive and deep as it possibly can be. Because if you are a small business, what you actually need is the minimal amount of restrictions that could impede your ability to trade across borders. So as an example, let me just talk about trade in goods for a moment. If you're a small business, what you really need as much as possible is zero tariffs. You need to know that if you are trading a product from my country to your country, that there is no tariff cost attached to that. And that applies to every kind of product that I might make, or I might grow, or I might develop. That would be extremely helpful for small businesses. A related provision that matters a great deal to small businesses is to have the de minimis threshold, below which you need to pay no tariffs and no taxes and have no customs paperwork, because increasingly small businesses trade in relatively small amounts. And so having that de minimis threshold at a level that allows small businesses to compete is very important. So if we can get our small businesses to compete in this way, I think that that's extremely helpful. So having an MSME chapter, having capacity building, but also having deep and comprehensive commitments really is very helpful for small businesses, because again, they can't deal with complexity. They're very stretched, they're resource poor. So allowing them to have tariff-free treatment, de minimis provisions that matter, services that can be delivered without a local presence, all of those kinds of things are very important in helping small businesses. Now, they're not explicitly labeled as MSME friendly provisions, right? It's not that I cut tariffs and I say that's an MSME provision, but at the end of the day, that's the kind of thing that actually matters for helping small businesses engage better and more effectively in trade. So having deep, comprehensive agreements, much better, including the kinds of things that small businesses tend to produce or the kinds of services that small businesses tend to deliver, is very important. Now, this collides often with the political realities in many countries. For example, small businesses are often involved in the creation of food products, and food and agricultural products have a lot of obstacles, including tariffs that are high, standards and labeling requirements, and a whole lot of challenging issues around the delivery of food products in a cross-border setting. That's a challenge for small businesses. So to the extent possible, thinking about how does a small business create some particular food product, and could they deliver that as a result of the RTA or the FTA, I think would be very, very helpful in delivering real world benefits to a small business, because they tend to be, again, in food, in textiles, in apparel, handicrafts of all different kinds, and then increasingly in the services sector. So if we have a goods only agreement, we're not really helping our small businesses, because we need them as well to be able to engage in cross-border delivery of services. So deep and comprehensive really helps MSMEs, even if it's not explicitly labeled as MSME provisions in an FTA. And then the fourth way that you can support MSME engagement in cross-border trade through an FTA or RTA is through the what we typically call e-commerce, but is really digital trade provisions. And the reason that I say that is that for most small businesses who are prepared to trade, they are digital. They are often born digital, or they have some kind of digital element. And most small businesses under COVID have learned to pivot very quickly from a pure offline environment to at least a hybrid online offline environment. And for many small businesses under COVID who pivoted completely to an online environment, they discovered, in fact, customers were not just in their local area, but could be found, as you would hope, in digital, anywhere in the region. And increasingly, for small businesses to survive COVID, they needed to find new sources of economic growth. And often those new consumers of their goods and services were in different markets entirely. So buying and shipping online goods in e-commerce delivery, and also the online provision of services, very, very important. And I know I often get this question about what kinds of services can small businesses produce. Small businesses can do all kinds of things, everything, sometimes very specialized small business services application in consulting or engineering, for example. But many times it's also services that are perhaps less specialized, but very important: human resources, accounting, all kinds of financial services, graphic design, lots of different kinds of services can be delivered cross-border by smaller firms. So having a good services delivery system is very, very important for MSMEs in that digital space. That is another area that increasingly governments have not identified as a key MSME part of an FTA or RTA. But if you ask a small business, what is the most important part of this agreement for you? It's often the ability to deliver digital goods and services that makes a difference for them in surviving and thriving, or them not being able to do terribly well. And I think COVID just highlighted for all of us the importance of digital provisions. So in sum, I would say there are 4 different ways then for a FTA or RTA to deliver benefits to small businesses. The first and the most obvious for government is to make a chapter developed or devoted to small business issues. That could be very valuable, but ultimately may be less relevant, especially because if you focus too much on that chapter, you are not focusing on those other things that I think are just as important, which is capacity building for small businesses in the development chapter or in the cooperation chapter, or whatever it is that you call it, but ultimately support for MSME engagement. A good FTA or RTA that is as deep and comprehensive as possible so that small businesses can actually deliver goods and services across borders with minimal amount of restrictions. And then the last thing, increasingly critical, as COVID has illustrated for all of us, to be able to do so in a digital space. So including more provisions that allow cross-border delivery of digital services, and also e-commerce delivery of goods aimed at those smaller firms. So again, that de minimis threshold, which sounds sort of sounds like a very abstract issue, is absolutely critical if you're a small business, because you're not sending typically 40-foot containers of anything. You're sending one box, and you need to be able to deliver that one box without having to worry about different tariff rates, customs paperwork, customs forms, weird tax levels, et cetera, that will erode your profits and make it uncompetitive for you to engage in cross-border trade. So I think if governments could do those 4 things and could think about the importance of small businesses as they are negotiating, we would ultimately end up with better trade agreements, and trade agreements that actually can better deliver on the promise of economic growth and economic development. Because if you can't harness the efforts of your smallest firms in your economy, then you have missed an enormous opportunity to expand growth and development prospects for everyone. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions from you in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I mean, you've been very precise, right, and very concrete in some of the things that you would like to see included in RTAs, and I think I really like this idea that it's not necessarily the need for SME chapter, but making sure that provisions throughout different chapters take into account the needs of MSMEs. So I think this is a very important message. There is a lot of questions that have been submitted that have been sent to you on MSMEs. So please take a look, and then after we're done with the other two presentations, we'll come back to you for hopefully some answers and insights. So on that note, let me now invite Matthias. Matthias Elbel is from the World Health Organization. He was from Asian Development Bank. I don't know, apparently he's still also from Asian Development Bank. So I don't know how many hats you have, Matthias, these days. But he's really has been working on health and trade for a very long time. I'm not so sure on health related provision in FTAs specifically. But let's hear from Matthias on his insights on that topic.
Thank you so much, Jan, for the kind introduction. It's good to see you and other friends, and welcome everybody to this session on trade and health, in particular during my presentation. As you all know, we're still living through a pandemic, and health, of course, is very much in the focus of our minds. WHO has been working together with WTO on this trade and health nexus for, I would say, almost 20 years. And I will try to give you an overview of what are some of the critical issues when it comes to trade and health, and also how they are linked to different chapters in FTAs. In particular, I will focus on health services. So let me first look in general more at the trade and health linkages. We know that, of course, good health is important for economic growth, but we also know that there is a trade impact on health. And let us first look at the left-hand side on the indirect effects. So we know that trade often leads to more economic growth, and this economic growth, of course, also good to promote public health, to build up health systems that provide access to health services and new health technologies for everybody. We also observed, mainly in the 1980s, that there was the trade of harmful, hazardous substances, especially towards Africa. And of course, there was a tremendous health impact of people who were exposed to these hazardous substances. Very important is this link with the food, and Deborah already mentioned more and more trade in foodstuff. And here, of course, there are two important aspects when it comes to trade. One is about food safety, and then the other one is about diet and obesity. And in the WTO framework, as you probably all know, we have the SPS agreement as well as a TBT agreement. And I guess you know the difference between these two agreements. The SPS is about food safety, whereas the TBT agreement is more about labeling, about requirements of packaging. And I think especially when it comes to the latter part of diet and obesity, we will see a lot of new policies being taken by governments that also impact trade. And I would like to talk about this just for 2 minutes. Just yesterday, I was in a meeting about obesity and what can governments do to fight obesity, because of course obesity is a growing trend in the region. We have seen numbers that are really frightening. Obesity costs the health system a lot every year, and that's why governments are taking more and more measures. And I just would like to focus on a couple of measures that are currently being considered, maybe also in your country. So, for example, a lot of governments are now introducing taxes on unhealthy foods. They're also restricting the marketing to children. They also set food standards in schools. So a lot of those measures, they have a direct trade impact because a lot of this food is actually imported. So the question is how to make sure that the trade and health policies, they are consistent and don't and are not in conflict with WTO obligations or also obligations in FTAs. Now, the most direct link between trade and health is, of course, the trade in medicines and related trade, and also the trade in health services. And just very briefly about trade in medicines, and of course, now with the pandemic, everybody is aware of the fact that trade is very important to provide medicines and also rated goods like PPEs across the world, but also in terms of value chains to produce vaccines. We have shown during the pandemic that it's very important to keep the trade open to ensure that these life-saving drugs and vaccines can cross borders easily. Just to share with you some numbers by the WTO. In terms of trade medical goods, more than half of those goods in terms of value are actually medicines. Then we have medical supplies, medical equipment, like for example, X-ray machines. And then in terms of personal protective products like gloves, we have about 13%. Now, one question is about the tariffs on those products. We have about 40% that are duty-free. We have another almost 66% that have a tariff below 5%. Yet we still have some tariffs that are relatively high. And I would invite you to look at your tariff schedule at the multilateral, but also at the regional and bilateral level. What tariffs are leveraged in medical goods? And does it really make sense to have high tariffs on medical goods, or does it rather impose additional costs for the healthcare system that are really costs in the end to the patient? And here we just have the numbers on the tariff rate. There are a lot of non-tariff barriers that still hinder the free trade of medical goods. And again, it can be quite a barrier to access new health technologies for the patients. So let me now talk the next 5 minutes about trade and health services. We have, of course, again, health services trade in the 4 modes of supply. The cross-border delivery, that is basically telehealth or telemedicine that is delivered across borders. Some of the main drivers are, of course, the unavailability of or undersupply of certain medical services, or just to benefit of lower cost of health services provided abroad. We have the example of a second opinion that is provided by Indian radiologists to US colleagues. In the Philippines, they basically help the US in terms of their medical transcriptions. There are challenges for the provision, but I won't go into the details. You will get the slides after my presentation. I have a little bit more slides than I have time, but I thought it's good for you to have access to the slides later, and then you can study them at your leisure. In terms of consumption abroad, this is often called medical tourism, but I would refrain from calling it tourism because it's often really a much needed treatment that the patient undergoes. So we prefer to call it medical travel. We see that this medical travel is occurring among developed countries, developing countries, but also between developed and developing countries for actually various reasons. Often there's a certain service that is not available in a certain country. We also have differences in quality of healthcare services. And of course, there are cost considerations. Mode 3 is the commercial presence. That is the case when a healthcare center is established abroad by a private company or a foreign service provider. It's a trend that we see more and more in Southeast Asia also. Then important is also the movement of natural persons. This is the temporary movement of health personnel, so it's not the permanent migration, it's not the integration into a labor market, it's really the temporary movement. However, it's getting very important because we know that there is a lack of healthcare workers in almost every country in the world. And of course, there is a big incentive for healthcare workers to take this opportunity because they have bigger earning opportunities abroad. We also know that these modes of supply are interrelated. This is an example of a Singapore medical center in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. So it's an example of a mode 3 investment. This medical center partners with hospitals in Singapore. So there's mode 1 trade taking place. It targets patients from Cambodia, but also medical travelers. It employs medical professionals not only from Cambodia, but from other countries. So it's also mode 4. So often these modes of supply are interrelated. As you can imagine, COVID-19 had a negative impact on mode 1 and mode 4 trade, because those two trades, types of trade, they require the movement of people across borders. So the WTO recorded a strong fall in those two modes of supply. But I think as we are seeing the end of the pandemic, we will see again an increase in those modes of trade. Now, let me spend 2-3 minutes more on the policies to make trade work for health. And I just want to take the example of mode 2 trade, so medical travel. For the country that exports the service, so that receives the medical travelers, of course, medical travel can generate foreign exchange. It can also help to upgrade health infrastructure, knowledge, standards, and quality. For the importing country, like for example, the UK, it reduces the shortage of physical and human resources in specialty areas. It can also mean that patients receive more affordable treatment. However, there are also risks involved because it can create a two-tiered market structure. So basically a market segment for the rich, or often kind of more better off medical travelers. And then the second segment is basically the local population. It can also crowd out the local population. It can also divert resources from the public health system. And for the importing country, it can also imply additional costs if the medical travel, for example, goes wrong, and there are additional costs then involved to treat the patient again. I would just like to mention those opportunities and risks, because for all of those modes, we find risks and opportunities. And the big challenge is to find a balance between those and to ensure that we protect public health when we open trade in health services. In terms of gaps, the commitments for health services are very limited, and I don't want to go into too many details. So as I said, if you open up trade in health services, it's about mitigating risks. Can the country do so in an effective way? Does the country have the regulatory capacity, experience to really mitigate those risks? That's another question. Here we have the commitments of the ASEAN countries in terms of health services, and the commitments, they differ across modes. We have a relatively open regime when it comes to medical travel, mode 2. This is because, of course, countries are eager to receive foreign patients. When it comes to mode 4, it's much more restrictive because, as I said, I mean, there are various reasons, but one of them is also that we want to make sure that the medical personnel that comes in is also properly qualified. Now, let me conclude with WHO's recommendations. We think it's important to identify a focal point for trade and health-related services within the Ministry of Health. So I guess most of you are from the Ministry of Trade. So I think it's very important to have a conversation with the Ministry of Health because the impact of an opening in health-related services can be quite dramatic. It's of course important that you understand what the possible impact could be. Therefore, it's good to try to collect and evaluate relevant data. And as I said, it's good to do a thorough assessment of health policy implications of a trade opening. And finally, if you decide to open for trade, develop a mechanism to monitor the impact of trade in health-related services. So let me conclude. Trade and health services can offer a lot of opportunities, but also comes with risks. You need to take a proactive, informed approach. More data is needed. We need to look also at the supply side constraints because unlike other sectors, we face a lot of supply side constraints in the health sector. Another important conclusion is that trade policy in health service needs to be coordinated with other services sectors like tourism, insurance, because of course health insurances play an important role. And finally, we think that there's still much more room for regional cooperation, more room for regional integration. So overall, I think we can create a trade regime and a better health outcome if we open up for more trade, but we have to be careful how we do it. That's all from my side. You can find more insights into how trade can meet, how we can use trade to meet the SDGs in this book that I published some years back together with Ben Shepherd. Thank you very much, Ian. Sorry for taking a bit more time.
Thank you, Matthias. No, but it was really good, Matthias. I think you really pointed out that because when some of the time when we look at the text of RTAs, we look for the health keyword, right, in the core text of the agreement, right, and then related provisions. But you emphasize a lot that actually it's important to take care of health also in the schedules, right, in the tariff schedules, in the services liberalization schedules, and yes, that's also something that is very, very important and where you can make a big difference. So thank you very much for highlighting this. And there is a number of small questions also in the chat on related to trade and health, including sources of data. And I know you're one of the person who put together HS code list of all the medical and health products, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that later on. So thank you again, Matthias. Let me move on to the next expert we have with us today. So we're very lucky to have Mrs. Lolita Lapperle-Forger. So that sounds very French. I don't think we've met, but that sounds French. So, and she's a trade and gender officer at the World Trade Organization in the development division. So WTO apparently has an entire trade and gender unit now. And so that was good news when I reached out. And so our research focuses on trade and gender issues with a particular interest for the gender provisions in trade and investment agreements. So we're very lucky to have her. And then please go ahead, Lolita.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Indeed, I speak French, but I'm Canadian. So. But I'm very pleased to be with you all today to discuss gender provision in free trade agreements. So let me share my slide. There. Okay. So first and foremost, why should we talk about gender provisions in trade agreements? Why these provisions are important?
Sorry, Lolita, would it be possible to make them full size?
Well, but if I do that, I would not have access to my notes. So is that is it a big issue?
I guess it's not anymore. We want to hear what you have to say, so your notes are more important. Okay.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
Okay.
But can you see it properly though?
Sorry, we can see the slides, yes?
Okay,
and it's
perfect.
bigger.
Okay. Okay, so yes, so I was saying why we should take into consideration gender provisions when we draft FTAs. So these are very important questions because gender-neutral provisions do not have gender-neutral impacts. So we cannot ignore actually the different role played by men and women that influence the opportunities that will be generated by the agreement. Men and women are involved in different sectors of activities, and they don't do business the same way, as well as they own different kind of businesses. For example, women tend to have smaller businesses than men, and has addressed by Deborah, micro and small businesses do not have the same access to the opportunities or do not participate in trade at the same extent as larger companies. And evidence shows that women own more often these kind of businesses. Also, men and women are have different kind of responsibilities in their communities, and this actually have an impact or affects how women and men will be able to seize the opportunities that would be brought by trade liberalization. Also, the existing gender inequalities and the various forms of discrimination against women prevent them from participating and benefiting from trade at the same extent as men. And to illustrate that, I will give you one simple example. So there are still many laws that discriminate women. And actually, the World Bank reports that women own only 3/4 of the rights of men. And this discrimination prevents women from benefiting from trade. And let's take, for instance, laws that discriminate women in the area of property ownership. So it directly affects women entrepreneurs because it reduces their access to finance because they cannot provide collaterals, and thus has a direct impact on their ability to grow their business and export. So I use this example to explain that discrimination against women that could at first seem unrelated to free trade agreements actually has a very important impact on how women and men will be able to seize the opportunities created by FTAs. So given this context, I think it's worth paying attention to the provisions in trade agreements that specifically and explicitly address women's needs and interests, so to ensure that FTAs can also work for women. So let's now discuss how gender issues are mainstreamed in free trade agreements. So we can see on the graph. You can see on the graph that the practice started in 1957, so long way before we started actually to talk about gender issues at the WTO. So it was the Treaty of Rome, and it addressed the gender equality. And we can see that from 1957 to the 80s, there was no additional gender provision in free trade agreements. Actually, it's the African countries who started the practice again, and they included the first gender provisions in one of their economic integration agreements, and this was actually a turning point. Since this moment, since this agreement, African countries included gender provisions and even full chapter on trade and gender in most of their economic integration agreements. And we can see on the graph that the practice started truly to emerge in the 90s, and it's a global trend. So a few numbers. I will not pass too much time on that. This is just to demonstrate that gender provisions are not new, and neither they are scarce, nor they are isolated. So we can see that there are more than 100 of trade agreements that are signed. So there are 5 that are not enforced, but that includes specific gender provisions for a total of 239 provisions that are enforceable and 7 full chapter enforced that focus solely on trade and gender issues. So I said that it's not an isolated practice. Indeed, no. There are actually FTAs with gender provision applicable almost in every country of the world. So this is a very well established practice. But now let's more focus on the substance of these gender provisions. So we can also note that gender provisions are not homogeneous in their substance. They address a wide range of different issues that are related to women's participation in the labor force, including equal wage, decent work for women, productive employment, leadership positions, flexible working conditions, and also some trade agreements provide for creating or ensuring a safe environment free from sexual harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace. There are also a certain number of provisions that address women entrepreneurs, or that aim to support women entrepreneurs. And we can find some references to the export capacity of women, the access to finance, productive resources, and technology, and also some provide for capacity building programs for women entrepreneurs. There are also a lot of non-trade issues that are included in free trade agreements, but they are actually trade issues. So, for instance, education. So, there are provisions that address women's access to education and health, gender-based violence, human trafficking, and sexual assault, women's political, social, and cultural rights. And I said that these are trade issues actually because these are all kind of gender issues that alleviate the ability of women to participate in trade or benefit from trade agreement at the same extent as men. So these kind of provisions are really not meaningless in free trade agreements. And to illustrate a bit more the substance of the provision, we will have a look on three different kind of provisions, and I took examples from free trade agreements negotiated by Asian countries, given the context of this training. So first, we have the UK-Japan FTA that prohibits discriminatory treatment against women in licensing and qualification in domestic services regulation. We also have the China-Peru FTA that provides for cooperation in agriculture, aims at developing a gender approach in development policies and strategies. And then we have the CPTPP that includes reference in the preamble as well as in several other provisions, and including one specific on women's economic empowerment. So now this is actually very important. It's the implementation instruments. So the graph here shows that most gender provisions are supposed to be implemented by means of cooperation. And the implementation instrument is critical to assess the extent of the commitment to promote gender equality, but also to assess the potential impact of the provision on women. So as I said, the implementation instrument indicates the nature of the commitment. So what parties should do to address the gender issues identified in the provision. And this has actually an impact on the bindingness of the provisions. So for example, a commitment to cooperate by way of dialogue and information sharing is lighter than a commitment to eliminate all laws that discriminate against women, because the latter provides for an obligation of results, whereas the former provides for an obligation of means, which leaves the implementation of the provision to the discretion and good faith of state parties. But I think it's important to note that regardless what I just mentioned, cooperation and dialogue can be very important tools. They are less binding than other implementation instruments, such as reforming laws or implementing capacity building programs. But at the very least, cooperating on gender issues or having gender provisions that provides for cooperation, at the very least, it puts gender issues on the agenda of trade negotiations. Now let's move to the mechanism of enforceability, and this is very important. So we can see from the first graph here that for a bit more than half of the gender provisions, the agreement charges a specific institution with a responsibility to monitor, evaluate, and review the implementation of the gender provisions. And this is actually important because it increases or even it creates accountability for state parties regarding the implementation of the gender provisions. Also, we can see on the second graph that the vast majority of the gender provisions are not excluded from the scope of the dispute settlement mechanism. It's actually a recent practice to do so. Although most gender provisions are not excluded from the dispute settlement mechanism, it's only a few that are actually binding and that could actually result in a dispute settlement. Indeed, because it's not all gender provisions that are by nature that have the characteristic, the requirement, I would say, to be subject to a dispute settlement. Let's say that provisions that identify cooperation as the implementation instruments are not likely to be subject to a dispute settlement, right? Also, the language used and the precision of the commitment is critical to assess the level of bindingness of a provision. So, for instance, the verb shall, must, and will indicate a higher level of bindingness compared to the, let's say, promote dialogue, I would say. So this is just a few indicators to take into consideration when drafting gender provisions. So on this basis, we can divide in 4 categories gender provisions and assess the level of commitment undertaken by state parties to promote gender equality in trade liberalization. So this scale of commitment is based on 3 indicators: the language and precision of the provisions, the implementation instruments that are provided, and the mechanism for enforceability that are provided by the agreement. So globally, the vast majority of the gender provisions fall into level 3, which demonstrate a moderate level of commitment to achieve gender equality, but nevertheless, countries agree to cooperate on gender issues in the context of their trade liberalization. So, as I said, at the very least, it put gender issues on the agenda and it raised awareness. So to briefly conclude, there are 4 important steps to consider when drafting an FTA that will work for women. So first, there's the ex-ante assessment to identify the potential risk and opportunities for both men and women. So this has to be completed before adopting the agreement. And this includes gender disaggregated data on the labor force, businesses, and all kind of data that could be relevant to assess the risk and the opportunities to liberalize the market. Then the second step would be to draft a trade agreement that considers gender issues in all chapters and provisions, and not only on one specific chapter. So gender issues need to be mainstreamed in every part of the agreement, and not only with specific gender provisions, but also in gender neutral provisions. It has to be consistent with the chapter on gender, for instance. Also, when drafting the trade agreements, not only to take into consideration gender and gender issues, but also to include specific gender provisions to address the existing gender inequalities that would prevent women to benefit at the same extent as men of the FTA. Third step regards the design and implement gender responsive trade policies. And this is important. This is not because some commitments are gender neutral that they cannot be implemented in taking into consideration gender issues. So gender neutral provisions should be implemented with gender responsive trade policies. Then the last step would be to conduct a gender impact assessment to verify 2 things actually: that the FTAs is implemented in a way that it contributes to gender equalities and doesn't exacerbate the inequalities among the population, and especially among men and women. And the second thing is to verify that the gender provisions are well implemented. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lolita. There is a number of questions for you in the chat, but it's very useful, your contribution, because the course so far covers 4 things, right? The course that we have. It covers environment provisions, it covers MSME provision, it covers labor provision, and it covers health, in particular because of the COVID-19 crisis. Everybody thought that it was important, right? But it doesn't cover gender. So that's why we invited you and W2 to brief us on this. I think it's very clear. Hopefully, maybe we can see in the future whether we can add this 5th module, short module, possibly in collaboration with WTO to the course. So we do cover gender as it should be. So thank you very much for that. Let me go back now. I think we actually only have 15 minutes left, right? So it's not a lot, but maybe let's go back in turn, right? To Deborah. So I think I'm assuming, Deborah, you've had time to look at the chat or to look at the questions, or do you want me to select some for you, or whatever you prefer?
I have looked, but if you have one that you thought was particularly relevant for your audience, please let me know what that is.
I don't have, I mean, I think they are all very relevant. The one I put 2 in the chat because those were received actually before the session. And one was, did MSME related provision in FTA really help MSMEs engage in international trade? And so this is really, it always goes back, right? Every time, as soon as we talk about sustainable development provision, is it really useful, right? And so I know you addressed this a little bit, but maybe you can maybe elaborate a little bit more. And then second question was, MSMEs have relatively weak lobbying power. How do you increase incorporation of relevant provision in RTAs? I mean, I already have an answer for that, but I think this is something that is very useful if you can address it. Yeah.
Sure. So let me answer those. The one other question that came in that's simple to deal with is the difference between SMEs and MSMEs. We used to talk about small and medium enterprises, SMEs, and then we realized that we were missing a huge pool of businesses that are micro. So depends on where you are, they all have different definitions, but micro enterprises typically are less than 10 people in a micro enterprise. And so if you miss the micro, the first M, then you miss an opportunity again to think about how trade might matter for even smaller firms. So now the preferred choice for many governments is MSMEs instead of SMEs, so that you capture a larger pool of smaller businesses. Now, they struggle with lots of things because they are resource constrained. They don't have a lot of time, they don't have a lot of staff, they don't have a lot of capacity themselves. You know, the founder or the executive is busy doing 1,000 things, and they don't have the ability to keep track of complicated rules, especially in cross-border trade, which is why I think it is useful to have an MSME chapter, because it focuses government mind on the problem. But I think it also can be distracting, because then you can say, I have sorted all of the problems relevant to small firms by sticking them in one chapter. And as I mentioned in my remarks, I think it's very important to think about the whole of the RTA or FTA and how the entire agreement can be made more facilitating for smaller firms from the beginning. When you do that, you actually result in better benefits for smaller firms, many of which are actually quite competitive in both goods and services, and many of which can be extremely successful in powering their own growth and development through using trade tools. But the challenges that they face are often the things that governments deal less with, like incompatible standards, labeling laws that are different, testing regimes, lots and lots of non-tariff issues like slower trade facilitation for smaller packages. Sometimes you can be held up at the border if you're shifting one small box, sometimes longer than the large multinationals with 40-foot containers. And so there's a number of reasons why small businesses struggle to engage in cross-border trade. Trade agreements can deal with many of them, but I think, like our last speaker just suggested, one way to make these agreements more facilitating for small businesses is to start with the attitude that you are going to try to create rules that could be used by the smallest firms in the economy. And if it works for the smallest firms, then obviously it works for the largest firms. And because those small businesses, and this will just tie to that second question, do have limited capacity to push for their own interests, government has to do it on their behalf. And so you have to sort of take an SME first mindset as a government official when negotiating many of these provisions, because you're not going to have access to very many good small businesses to explain to you what the issues are. So as much as possible, reach out to MSME firms, get their information from them. But ultimately, government will have to think about, how do I facilitate trade for the smallest companies, even if they can't advocate the rules that they would prefer on their own.
All right. So thank you very much, Deborah. I mean, there was a question on the cost of compliance for SMEs. I don't know whether you wanted to very briefly address this.
It's high, you know, and it's one of the reasons why small businesses, again, don't trade internationally, because they'll get, here's an example. You know, we run a trade association. We have lots of small businesses. One of our businesses sells eyeglasses and had someone buy eyeglasses in Canada. Super excited, going to sell to Canada. Sent the first pair of glasses, and the tariffs were unexpectedly high, and the taxes as well. And so they lost profit. But even worse, the shipment went missing. So then they had to send a second set of glasses, and that also failed to arrive at the customer. So they had to send a third pair of glasses to the customer. And then the customer ended up with two pairs because the second one unexpectedly showed up. And now the poor firm has sent 3 separate pairs of glasses. They have lost a lot of money on this transaction. And they said, you know what, we actually don't want to sell overseas anymore, or at least not to Canada, because our experience has been so difficult and expensive that we will simply not deliver to these markets. And I think that is a typical problem for small businesses. The cost of delivery, the cost associated with trying to manage the rules can be so enormous for a small business that it's just not worth the opportunity, as excited as you might be about selling overseas. And so they ultimately cut themselves out of international trade because the compliance costs are too high.
Okay, thank you very much, Deborah. I mean, yeah, I think one thing that somehow wasn't mentioned too much, this was my favorite 2 words during this session, is trade facilitation, right? In trade facilitation measures, I mean, there is typically in RTAs a trade facilitation chapter now, and this is a very important chapter, I think, for SMEs and MSMEs. And then there is scope, I think, to include in those chapters, like you were saying, right, provisions that really can benefit MSMEs. I saw in the list of questions
yes,
this issue of compliance, right? So, I mean, for example, one of the things we are promoting in the UN Global Survey on Digital and Sustainable Trade Facilitation is the design of authorized economic operator program that enable SMEs to participate in them. So those things possibly can be tackled.
yes,
in a way.
I think this is key. I mean, these are some sort of unsexy topics that governments will say we've been working on for a long time, but they haven't really delivered in many cases results in the way that one would hope. And certainly for smaller businesses, it's these obstacles at the border and the costs at the border. A delay at the border means you can't sell to a customer. You know, this is a very big deal if you're a small firm, because a delay, like my eyeglass example, means that they've lost a ton of money and they're too small to be able to lose that kind of revenue regularly and still stay in business. So I think trade facilitation is an unsexy topic outside of ESCAP, but it's absolutely vital for smaller businesses. If you don't get that right, then they cannot compete.
Okay, right. Thank you. I mean, and then one of the, I think, of the key messages also from this discussion is that you need to have SMEs well represented in trade negotiation whenever possible, because they don't have the time to do that. So I think some of the associations, like the SME association that you're managing, and then chambers of commerce in different countries, have a very important role to play to make sure that the MSMEs are well represented in the negotiations, right?
Yes, but I think it's challenging because small businesses are not able to follow these kinds of policy discussions. So if I said to a small business, do you struggle with trade facilitation? They would look at me and they would say, what? I don't even know what the question is asking me. But if you said to them, have you tried to ship a box overseas? Yes. Have you had any difficulties shipping the box overseas? Oh, yes. Then you say, what are the problems? And they might say, well, you know, we got a customer who wanted to return a product and we just couldn't, it took us so long and was so complicated to manage a return that we just said, keep the product. You know, so you have to ask the right questions for small businesses for them to be able to give you the information that you need. And one of the challenges for government, I find, is they don't ask very good questions and they don't understand the answers they're getting. And so you end up with outcomes that are not helpful for small businesses. And it's largely just because you have to ask the right questions of the right kinds of small businesses. And you need to really dig hard to get at what are the actual obstacles for smaller companies and not just what people think the smaller companies struggle with. And it's often large firms who speak on behalf of small firms, but they've never worked in a small firm. They have no idea what the small firms struggle with. Governments have never worked for small companies. And so that sort of disconnect is real and it matters a lot in making policy.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Deborah. I mean, I hear a lot of noise in my phone, so I think maybe there's some more questions and things and comments that have been made, so you may want to take a look before you go. But thank you very much. Let me turn to Matthias on the health. So Matthias, I think I've seen that you've replied some of the questions already in the chat. Is there any one that you want to elaborate upon?
Thank you very much, Jan. So I tried to reply to all the questions in the chat. Although if there's still anything unclear, please send me an email. When it comes to these non-tariff measures, it can be quite opaque. So I think it's worthwhile looking what's going on in your country. Who is actually, between, the border and the patient, because there can be quite a bit of at the border or behind the border measures that make medical products very expensive at the end. Then I would also like to reply to the question that was asked prior to that session about the waiver for IP for vaccines. There is currently a proposal at the WTO to grant a waiver. I mean, one issue is that in this proposal, not every country would get this waiver. Countries with a certain percentage of exports, of world exports in vaccines, would not benefit from this waiver, and among them is China. There is resistance by certain governments to include this kind of qualifying requirements for the waiver. And of course, as you all know, this waiver is seen critically by certain countries which feel pretty strongly about protecting the IP rights of the industry. So it's a little bit hard to imagine, in my opinion, but this is not the opinion of WHO, how they could come together within 1 or 2 months to agree on a waiver within the MC12. Over to you, Jan.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Matthias. And then you raised the issue of non-tariff measures as well, as this in the chat, right? But non-tariff measures, I mean, if you look at the text of FTAs, it's, I mean, there is chapters dedicated to SPS, TPTs, technical ones, but after that, it's really a lot of freedom in a way, still for countries to put in place whatever non-tariff measures they want to put, right? And it's always very difficult to argue whether this is done for protectionism purposes or for a good reason, like health, right? Maybe the only way to address this specifically to FTAs is to have then specific health provisions. So mentioning the relevant health issues or products and say that needs to get some additional rules so that it's easier to trade them or things like that, right? But as we've done a little bit of work with this with Rachel, and then what we find is at this stage there are very few specific health-related provisions in the text of the agreement. So maybe some of that may need to be thought of. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on this.
I mean, it would be good if you know, if governments need the help of WHO, that they send a request to me, and then we can try to sit together and see what we can do. Yeah, the health sector is very important. So for many reasons, and we have seen in the recent pandemic or in the current pandemic how crucial good health is. Please feel free to contact me and we can look at it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, just, I mean, there is, after all, chapters on MSMEs, right? So there could be a chapter on health, right? Maybe WHO can work on the model chapter at some point on that. Just food for thought, because I don't think we've seen that in any of the agreements yet, but they are expanding in scope and scale. So, all right. Thank you very much, Matthias. Let me move to Lolita on trade and gender. So you have a few questions, Lolita. Some of them were sent to you earlier. So one of them was, what is the relationship between gender and labor provision? So I guess that's maybe a tricky one. And how gender provision in FTAs can affect domestic gender equality policies in one country, among others. So please feel free to react, Lolita.
Okay, thank you. So I will start with the first one, the relationship between gender and labor provision. So in my perspective, they share a common objective, which is to make trade more inclusive and fair. So to ensure that international trade will not exacerbate inequalities among the population. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the most commonly gender issues addressed in gender provisions are related to labor, actually. So it means that one of the top priorities when it comes to include gender issues in FTAs is to address women's participation in the labor force, but not only to increase it, but also to ensure that female workers have access to productive employment, leadership position, as well as they have decent working conditions free from discrimination and gender-based violence, I would say. So I could also add that gender-neutral provisions on labor, which like most of them are gender-neutral provisions, but they can actually have a very positive impact on women. So if an FTA provides for decent work, better jobs, full implementation of the labor rights, and even provisions regarding corporate social responsibility, if they are fully implemented, women can benefit from it, and I think it's a no-brainer that if the working conditions are better, women workers will also have better working conditions. But this is, I should add that it's important to include gender issues or take into consideration gender issues when drafting laws, national laws, and drafting this kind of provision in FTAs. So regarding the first question, on my personal view, this one was more tricky, I would say. How gender provision in FTA can affect domestic gender equality policies in one country. So I think that addressing gender issues in FTA highlights that gender issues are directly linked to trade issues. So usually in domestic gender equality policies, they are more oriented toward social issues and not so much considering the trade component of the gender issues. So gender provisions add this component and can have the impact to widen the scope of these policies, of these gender equality policies, to the trade policies adopted to implement an FTA. So in other words, when implementing an FTAs, the domestic gender equality policies should be taken into consideration to design gender responsive trade policies. So there's a direct link. And I could also say that the domestic gender equality policies affect the implementation of the FTAs, and that gender provision in FTAs also affects these gender equality policies by integrating trade and economic aspects to their implementation. If I may, there was also one question regarding reservations. If there are reservations in FTAs regarding gender issues, actually there's only 2 examples, and the first one regards reservations that the United States are taking and in the areas of public procurement. So what they do is that they reserve the right to give preferential treatment to women-owned businesses in public procurement. So this is to implement their national laws that provides quotas. I think it's a 5% quotas for vulnerable population that explicitly include women-owned businesses. And the second example is Mexico, that actually takes reservation regarding cultural goods. So this is to protect indigenous cultural rights, and they include, like, they specify that this reservation should be implemented with respect to the principle of gender equality. So if there are additional questions, feel free to reach out to me at the WTO.
Okay, thank you very much, Lolita. I mean, very comprehensive answers, and I think a general comment is that, I mean, one good reason to include sustainable development provision in RTAs is to support reform, sustainable development-oriented reform at home, right? I mean, that's always the trick, right? You put a provision in an international agreement, then that you can go to your domestic constituency and say, well, we actually need to do it, right? And then sometimes it's very important because otherwise you get a lot of resistance, right? So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right, Lolita, thank you very much. I mean, we are 4 minutes beyond the session time, so I don't want to take anybody's time longer than necessary. So thank you very much to all the speakers. And what I'm going to do now, right, because this is the last live sessions, those of you who want to leave, please go. But what we are going to do is I'm going to ask Rachel to play the video, pre-recorded video of one speaker who could not come because we could not participate live because she's in the US. He's too far away. Catherine Kuhlman, who is a professor at Georgetown University and working with us on trade in times of crisis and sustainable development. So maybe let's play that video. Those of you who have the time, please, you can watch it now. Otherwise, it will be included in the recording anyway. And on that note, I think thank you to everyone again for your wonderful presentations and questions and participation. Rachel, can you play that video? Or whoever in the team?
Yes, I will play it now.
I'm going to summarize some of the key considerations and trends on the link between trade and sustainable development in RTAs, and focus on some emerging approaches as well. This is based on research I have underway at Georgetown University Law Center, where I am a professor and the faculty co-director of the Center on Inclusive Trade and Development, as well as work at the New Markets Lab. So what matters when looking at a trade agreement and trying to determine how responsive it is to development? One question to start with is which trade and development priorities should be a focus and how these can be advanced through trade instruments. It's also really useful to look at common approaches across RTAs and then compare these across issues, regions, and countries that are similarly situated. We often tend to also look at whether provisions are more binding or less binding, especially those of us who are lawyers. This influences where provisions appear in a trade agreement. For example, provisions in a preamble or objectives tend to be less binding, even though they can set the tone for the entire agreement, while those in a whole chapter tend to be more binding. And language matters. Use of the word shall, for example, connotes a much more binding commitment than something like will endeavor to undertake, which is much less binding. And the binding nature of provisions can sometimes go 2 different ways. For example, less binding commitments might be desired by some countries on measures that are costly or require scarce capacity, whereas more binding commitments might be desired in areas to build capacity and offer technical assistance. It's also important for negotiators to know what their options are. And here we did produce a handbook with ESCAP on provisions and options for trade in times of crisis and pandemic, with a number of options for negotiators. We're building this out further now. And then these final 2 points are things that don't often get considered as much. How to ensure impact on particular stakeholders, especially with respect to equity and inclusion. And how can top-down approaches, trade agreements, and WTO rules be combined with more bottom-up approaches that focus on domestic law and stakeholder needs? Trade and development are increasingly linked, which can expand and enhance human rights and protect workers, women, and vulnerable communities. And trade rules can support implementation of the SDGs in important areas like agriculture and access to medicines. Yet it's really important to keep in mind that trade and development approaches are not always equal, nor are they always neutral. For one, the benefits of the current system are uneven. More advanced economies have captured more of the gains of trade, and some countries have consistently acted as the rule makers, leaving others to be the rule takers. There are also historical goals of trade and development that remain unrealized after many years, including increasing export share for developing countries, and some of the more recent movements, such as including duty-free, quota-free treatment for least developed countries, and other aspects of the stalled Doha development round. Inequality, vulnerability, unequal distribution of benefits, and lack of equity deserve so much more attention. Development sometimes can be disguised protectionism as well, or be used to level the playing field for developed economies at the expense of broad-based development. And it can conflict with traditional trade focus on non-discrimination, creating some really important questions for further consideration. So what do we need to think about? For one, the staging of commitments. For example, economic development and environmental adaptation may need to be prioritized alongside environmental mitigation, and more balanced stakeholder participation is needed across the board. As the pandemic highlighted, we really need to take into account vulnerabilities at the state and stakeholder levels, which can lead to some really interesting approaches in trade agreements. And policy space is something that continues to be a very important debate in areas like IP, environment, agriculture, finance, and energy. When we look at trade agreements, we tend to start at the top down, looking at the agreements themselves and how they are designed and negotiated. It's often common to start with the form and structure of an agreement and to use that as our main comparative factor. Where does development come up? Is it in the preamble, in the objectives, in provisions throughout the agreement, or in a separate chapter or side agreement? There's quite a bit of variation here, and the law is evolving in really interesting ways. European RTAs, for example, tend to include a sustainable development chapter, focused on the 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, and incorporating intergenerational equity as well. We could say that this follows the baseline created by the WTO that includes sustainable development in its preamble, although the WTO doesn't really have an action plan for how to achieve this. Other RTAs, such as US RTAs and CPTPP, include issue-focused chapters that incorporate provisions on labor, environment, and SMEs. And more recent RTAs give us even more to think about. The African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, for example, which is a building block agreement, includes objectives that link sustainable development and inclusive development. And new issue-focused RTA models are emerging, like the ACTS Agreement, focused on climate change, trade, and sustainability, and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that includes provisions on digital inclusion. Some RTAs on their face don't seem to include development as much, such as the RCEP, which doesn't encompass provisions on labor and environment, but does have provisions on special and differential treatment and other important areas like traditional knowledge. And then we start to look at the design elements. What types of commitments are included, or what types of provisions are included in these areas? The commitments to cooperate are the most common. These can take the form of an exchange of information, general cooperation, assistance, or even harmonization or joint institution building. It's also common to see commitments in trade agreements to uphold other legal standards, such as those in treaties and conventions, like human rights conventions, multilateral environmental agreements, and ILO conventions. Provisions on non-derogation from domestic laws to attract investment are also appearing. And provisions on transparency are quite common throughout RTAs, including in a development context, as are provisions on consultation and engagement. So far we've looked at what trade agreements do now, how they currently approach trade and sustainable development. But it's really important to look forward as well and consider what trade agreements might be able to do. There are several alternative approaches contained in the literature and put forward by countries themselves. And what all of these have in common is that they really focus more deeply on development needs and considerations of different countries, rather than just incorporating the principles of trade and sustainable development, which are certainly a starting point, but don't address every consideration. One is a methodology that I'll share in a moment that I've developed on inclusive law and regulation that blends the top-down and the bottom-up, along with stakeholder priorities. Another is a work that a colleague of mine, Amrita Bari, has done on gender responsiveness and a scale for assessing provisions in trade agreements that could be applied to other areas as well. Then there are several studies referenced here that have some common elements. Focus on capacity building, more meaningful special and differential treatment, considering declaratory provisions instead of binding commitments in some cases, and thinking in particular about the 3 pillars of sustainable development, economic, social, and environmental, while considering whether intergenerational equity is something that every country can take on in the near term as more pressing development needs need to be addressed. The sequencing of provisions on sustainable development and economic growth also needs to be considered, as do sovereignty, responsibility for investors, disciplines on non-tariff measures to avoid discrimination, and capacity building to address disparities in resource use. Finally, equity considerations in things that might have a high cost and capacity burden, like eco-labeling, are really important to consider going forward. Here is Amrita Bari's gender responsiveness scale. It ranges from limited responsiveness that includes provisions that build awareness, maybe a mere mention of gender, or affirmations, which might be a reference to a convention, and goes all the way up to optimizing provisions, those that create legally binding obligations and some kind of enforcement mechanism. Although this is particular to gender, it really does have application in other areas as well. And here is the methodology for inclusive law and regulation that I mentioned. It ranges from the historical incorporation of special and differential treatment provisions to more bottom-up approaches that should be considered alongside the top-down approaches we spoke about earlier. On special and differential treatment, we're seeing an evolution beyond more traditional provisions, which of course are included in many RTAs and the WTO covered agreements, to even more differentiated approaches that address things like gender, as well as a variety of provisions on capacity building. Here, one interesting example is a provision on the AFCFTA's protocol on trade and services that calls for countries to provide assistance to improve export capacity of formal and informal services suppliers, especially MSMEs, women, and youth. Flexibility is another dimension, and we've seen its importance throughout the pandemic. This relates directly to policy space and the right to regulate, and countries' ability to adapt to and respond to changing circumstances. This covers disciplines in a number of areas: food security, right to health, and public policy, and can bring up use of exceptions or dispute mechanisms or the design of provisions themselves. One example is the review and revise mechanisms that we see in some recent trade agreements, along with enhanced consultation provisions. Sustainability, of course, is central to this as well. But going beyond some of the more traditional sustainable development approaches, we can look at countries' particular needs and sectors of development interest. How can RTAs be tailored to this? And can they focus on sectors that could attract green investment and technology transfer? One example here might be to include a greater focus on environmental adaptation and industrial development. equity and inclusion need to be front and center at how we address trade agreements in the future. This goes well beyond capacity building, even though that's an important part of it, and goes to rules that are tailored to address the needs of different groups, such as minorities, traditional communities, women, LGBTQ+, and persons with disabilities, to name a few. Examples include minimum legal standards, gender-responsive services commitment, and tailored transparency provisions. And finally, we need to blend top-down approaches that focus on agreement design with bottom-up approaches that really incorporate domestic law and stakeholder experiences in practice. Two ways for doing this are looking at what I call regulatory gateways, or the regulatory hurdles that individuals and enterprises face as they try to go through a process of registering a business, moving across a border, or dealing with SPS measures. And here international law has quite a bit to learn from domestic law, where we see a variety of good practices rather than just this notion of one best practice. And then there is implementation and impact. How can regional trade agreements really work better in practice? This includes both ex ante and ex post assessments, but also links to domestic law, including administrative law, as well as transparency, consultation, and engagement provisions, and inclusive avenues for dispute settlement. For more detail and a range of options and provisions available to negotiators and policymakers, I just wanted to leave with a reference to the Handbook on Provisions and Options for Trade in Times of Crisis and Pandemic that I developed with ESCAP in 2021. Now in collaboration with ESCAP and my colleagues and students at Georgetown Law and New Markets Lab, we are further building out that book to include additional options and provisions focused on trade development. This will be coming soon, and your feedback will be welcome.
All right, very good. So thank you very much to everyone who stayed on. Actually, it's a presentation that is good because it's really looking forward a little bit of what may come next. My understanding, I'm told by Rachel that you have to tell you that you have 3 days to finish the quizzes, resubmit the quizzes if you still haven't done so, so you can complete the course and get the UN ESCAP certificate. On my end, what I wanted to say is that this course is a first level course we plan to have based on what Catherine is developing for us, and in collaboration with many partners, we plan to have a more advanced course on sustainable development provision in RTAs, possibly available towards the end of the year. The other thing I wanted to say, based on the comments I've seen from some of the participants in the chat, is that we at ESCAP, I mean, we are developing a strong program on trade negotiation support, right? So if your countries, developing countries in the ESCAP region are negotiating RTAs and they want technical assistance or feedback on certain provisions, then as you start negotiating, or as you in the middle of the negotiations, I mean, you can send us official requests from your government, and then we'll be happy to provide and facilitate proper feedback and advice. At the same time, what we are also doing is we are developing an online trade intelligence and negotiation advisor system, right? So TINA. So it's a kind of an artificial intelligence system to support trade negotiations. So it's already, I think some of you have already heard of it. You can access it at tina.trade. And then we are extending it now to include legal issues, right? So legal advice. So very soon, again with Catherine and Kuhlman and some other people in the team, we are going to launch a legal TINA before this September. And this legal TINA component of our trade intelligence and negotiation advisor is going to allow you to really look into details as existing text options for negotiation based on what is already available and what we think is good practice or emerging good practice. So all this will become available freely, automatically online to many of you. But you can obviously still request technical assistance from ESCAP and others as you see fit. So on that note, again, thank you very much for your participation. And then Rachel will be in touch with some of the technical details to finish the course to finish up the course, right? I think there is one, even though you have completed the quizzes, we have an online evaluation form that we really want you to complete before you can get the certificate, so we can improve for the next course. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.